Right, hi there. Welcome one and all to BOZAR. Thank you for attending this special session of European Lab, part of Nuit Sonore. This is going to be a pretty interesting debate on the climate change, the climate emergency, and what do we do about it? What do we do when actually next year is seen as an incredibly big year in the climate calendar of how we need to rise up together to try and tackle this crisis? Before going any further, some housekeeping. This is being streamed live, so for those live, hello, welcome. And the European Lab Forum starts again tomorrow at 5, particularly if you're online, I assume. But maybe to be quick, my name is Pasco Sabido. I work at the Corporate Europe Observatory, which is here in Brussels. We try and expose the power of multinationals over our political system. I particularly work on climate change and have been involved in the climate movement, climate justice movement for many years. But unfortunately for you, I'm also English. I'm from London, which means I can talk really quickly with a bad accent, with a big echo. So if I'm talking too quickly, honestly, just do this, and I will talk slower. And I really appreciate that this is in English, which is a lot of people's second languages. So yeah, do not hesitate, including those on the panel, to tell me to slow down. But to give a bit of context, I guess, this is called Rebellion in 2020. So there's been a lot of excitement this year, a lot of people coming out into the streets around climate change. You've had Extinction Rebellion declaring a climate emergency, and you've had local governments around Belgium doing similarly. You've had the Youth Strikes for Climate coming out. More than 7 million people came out on the 20th of September. We've never seen these sorts of numbers around climate change, and the focus, media focus and public focus on this issue has never been this high. It seems pretty massive, but the question is, if we want to tackle a problem as big, as broad, as wide, as complex as climate change, we need, a lot of power, and we need to keep getting bigger. We need to keep building. This is not going to happen with the power we have now. So 2020 has been called by many different movements across Europe, movements working on climate justice. 2020 has been called as a year when we need to rise up. We need to build our power and rise up and escalate. But the question is, we can all rise up, but if we want to build power, we have to do this together. We have to actually converge, work together on trying to fight for climate justice, for a livable future, for a dignified way of life. And this converging, coming together, often poses problems. So the question is, how do we do this? This is the debate we're here to have today. I have 4 people on this panel, all involved in the climate movement, and some have been for many, many years. I have on my right Anja Verkamp, who is American-Peruvian, but has been living in Brussels since last year and is involved in Extinction Rebellion Brussels. I have Anne-Marie Gisling, apologies Anne-Marie, I probably always get it wrong, who's a Belgian climate activist involved in many different collectives and projects for many years, one of them being Act for Climate Justice. I have Ruth Paluku, who's a queer Afro-feminist activist who's been involved in organizing the climate justice camp here in Belgium this year. And then on my left I have Juliette Rousseau, who's an author on the convergence of struggles. She's written a book called Struggling Together. I don't know if you have a copy to show. Here we go, from the audience. I love this audience participation already. I'm going to try and make this interactive. But a little fact that's quite useful, she's also the ex-coordinator of the climate coalition around COP21, the UN climate talks that happened in Paris, France at the end of 2015. So I had her experience of trying to converge. But let's get on with it. So 2020 is not very far away. And if we really want to be bigger and stronger by 2020, stronger than we already are, we need to be building and getting people onto the streets now. So luckily, on Monday is the beginning of 2 weeks of the international rebellion organised by Extinction Rebellion. In London, where I'm from, Westminster is going to be shut down for 2 weeks, or that's the intention. But here, from Anu in Belgium, we'd like to hear, of course, the plans of what's going on in Belgium, but also the question that I think, is quite an obvious one, but why is this happening now? Why did this not happen before? Why is everyone getting so aware of the climate and out on the streets and doing things they've never done before?
So to answer why now, I think that the climate movement has been building for decades on different kinds of tactics and different kinds of messaging. Extinction Rebellion itself is coming out of the network of activists in the UK called Rising Up, who have 20 years of experience in different civil disobedience strategies on different issues that include social issues, not just environmental. And I think that the climate movement finally found the right messaging and the right action to match it. And it's the same one that other movements found, such as Ende Gelände and the Fridays for Future. So Ende Gelände is a German movement of using mass civil disobedience to block, specifically, the prime site is a coal mine in Western Germany. But that message being that it's a matter of life or death and that we have nothing left to lose. Because if we don't act, then we don't have a future. And therefore, we should act as if our lives depend on it. And the way to do that is to refuse to comply, to put yourself on the line, to make sacrifices, and to commit real sacrifice through a personal commitment to civil disobedience. And the youth have understood that. The youth have understood that, and that's why they've come out saying, what is the good of studying, to get a good job, to have a nice house someday, if by the time I'm 35 or 45, it looks like civilization could collapse. And they got it. They got the truth, the youth, and they came out with it, and they said it like it is. And that's the same message that Extinction Rebellion has been using. Which is to tell the truth and to come out and say it like it is. And that is correcting a major error that the climate movement has been making, which is that we come out and we say, it's life or death, it could be collapse, now sign a petition. It's life or death, it could be collapse, come out to a march. And instead to say, it's life or death, and now we need to rebel. We need to refuse to comply with the government that is putting the lives of all citizens at risk. That makes sense, and that's worked. So that's why now. That's why it's worked now and it hasn't worked before, because we found the right messaging after years of different strategies. What's coming up? For Extinction Rebellion, we're also building, so there's been 2 moments of rebellion, one in October of last year and one in April of this year. Both of those have led to major actions, particularly in London, but in April as well around the world, as the movement's been growing internationally, including here in Belgium. And October 7th will be a day of international rebellion. In London, they plan to occupy Westminster. Many in Belgium will be joining the events in Amsterdam and Paris, and you're welcome to come. But here in Brussels itself, Extinction Rebellion Belgium will be occupying on October 12th, for strategic reasons, the gardens of the Royal Palace, here in front of the Parc Royal. And we'll be occupying it to hold group discussions on different questions of climate and the necessary transition. And that is part of an escalation that we plan up to next year. We expect 500 to 1,000 people on October 12th, and our plan for next year is to rise up to 10,000 people. doing that by strategically escalating our actions leading up to that point. So there's a long-term goal, but it's going to require a regeneration each time, because this is not a fight that we think we're going to win next year. It's a fight that we're going to have to continue at. So this escalation is going to have to be balanced with reflection, with caring, with building community, with mutual support, that's going to allow the movement to continue on for decades, if that's what it will take.
Thank you very much. So next up, we're going to try and keep it short so we get audience interaction. Next up, we have Anne-Marie. And Anne-Marie, I mean, I have to say, the impression I get from the media, from the general public, the number of people who have become involved in Extinction Rebellion, who have never been involved in things before, there's the impression that this is happening for the first time. I think, as Anya has explained, this is clearly not the first time people have been mobilizing around climate. And you're involved in Act for Climate Justice. So it was formed in 2018. But obviously you've been involved in other groups before it. So is this new? Is this something really new? What do you think is different from what's happening now versus what you were doing last year, what you were doing the year before that? And how are you different? Act for Climate Justice.
Okay. So the question about is this something new? I think we can discuss it for hours and hours. I think because the climate issue and environment is not something new, but maybe it's something new in Europe for the white people. So we have the idea that it's something new, but people from centuries and centuries are fighting to protect the planet Earth. But they use different roads, and so it's also something really occidental to say that something is happening now for the climate and the planet. So I think it's revealed already maybe a bias that we have when we analyze those movements, and that we consider that something is happening only because it's happening in Europe, for instance, of United States, so in the Occident. But if we, beside the fact of having people fighting for environment and climate, there is always this question of, in French we say, nouveaux mouvements sociaux, so I don't know in English, new social movement, and there is, even for decades, there is this debate, is there new social movement? And you speak about the media. I think it's part of the answer. The media, they always want something new. So I think they will stress even too much the fact that there is something new happening. I don't believe that there is a lot of innovation in the struggles. A lot has been done in the past. I think that the social movement disappears, then they transform, they change and so on, but I don't know what's really new in our movements for the moment. For Belgium, for Europe, yes, we can say on the positive side that, yes, obviously there is something. Because maybe we will talk about them, there is no representative, but those youth who took the street, yes, it's something new. A mass movement like this with people under 18, it's something new, such as in the past we had women taking the streets, Afro-American taking the streets, so yes, I can say that maybe in the subject, the people in this movement, there is something new happening in Belgium, in Europe, and so on. So this is something positive that we can celebrate, that more people are in the movement. And to get back on one of the collective that I'm involved in, Act for Climate Justice. I'm involved in such group for 10 years now, so it's not new, it's just that it's bigger, there is more and more people ready to use civil disobedience. And as you say, media pay more attention. So if I have to underline one good point is that I remember that 10 years ago, there was a big border between the autonomous anti-capitalist movement and the NGOs. So maybe something that we are now a little bit trying to do, and we have sometimes some good examples, is that those autonomous movements and more radical can sometimes work with NGOs. And so sometimes we celebrate, and in our movement we say, okay, this is a really good example of convergence of struggles. But then we think a little bit more and we realize that, okay, it's just the first step of this convergence of struggle, because there is a lot of other groups. So it started in France with the Gilets jaunes, we have the same in Belgium, but we have anti-racist group. A lot of issues are connected to climate, and for the moment, this is the bad analysis. Maybe some NGO works a little bit better with autonomous movement, but there is not really a convergence between environment, climate, social, anti-racism, feminist movement. On the paper, everywhere. In the reality, in the streets, for the moment, almost nowhere.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. So, apologies for the lack of a youth strike for climate representation. I don't think any of us, I mean, maybe Ruth, you can almost pass off as, no, not even. So, none of us, but we did invite some of the youth strike for climate leaders on the Flemish side, and they're on a boat heading to Chile, to the UN climate talks in Chile. Unlike me, they don't fly, so they have to spend weeks on boats. C'est la vie, and unfortunately the French side, it's not comfortable in English. So unfortunately we don't, but I think there's enough knowledge in this room of many of those struggles. But Ruth, I mean, so we're hearing climate justice has been going for a while and a longer time, but you particularly were involved in organising a climate justice camp outside of Brussels, which I guess it has a different approach to just mass civil disobedience, getting as many people onto the streets as possible, an approach which is more about bringing different struggles together. You could even call it a longer term work. And I was wondering how you feel this fits in with the call to rise by 2020, to have this mass rebellion by 2020. And how does it make it more likely to succeed? Or in fact, are we doomed to fail?
Thanks. So for us, so the climate justice camp, the idea was actually also built just after just around the Act for Climate Justice. At first, it was really an idea about building a climate justice camp that could actually look like other climate justice camp in Europe, which would be like a lot of workshops, but mainly organized around a mass action for climate on a local point of view in Belgium. But at the same time, we were thinking about all these movements building, and also maybe look at a broader context. So when we are looking at the youth strikes, when you're looking at how the climate movement is building in Europe, in Belgium, you can see that, for example, there were like some articles about this, even in Brussels, about the fact that in the streets we only see, for example, white people, for example. We can talk about the fact that we don't see representation of women, or just because they are maybe just behind the decks doing the communication, or we don't see a representation of queer people, we don't see a representation of disabled people. And so our thoughts was like, how can we, as activists from different struggles already, can connect our different communities around the climate issue? And the answer was pretty simple, is that climate is linked to other struggles. Is that the climate emergency is linked to the colonial past of Belgium. Climate justice is built on the fact that we don't care about disabled people having accessible streets or having accessible, I don't know, cities and stuff like this. So our idea was like, okay, how can we build a space and time in Belgium as a climate justice camp to address those issues? And we quickly came to the conclusion that inaction, that the fact that putting an emergency on having an impact on governments, which is also questionable to actually wanting to have an impact on governments, because are really governments have the power to actually change climate crisis? I don't know. But the idea was like, can we create a place and time to actually connect all these struggles. And so we begin building the camp for, I would say, like 8 months. And it started on Shape the Camp. So the idea was to build events which were public, but for a part of them non-mix. So it was bringing feminist issues, get those people who were involved in these feminist issues to reflect on the climate movement, but also reflect on the actual issues that is connecting them as women, as trans women, as non-binary people to the climate issues, and how can they bring something more inclusive to the climate issues. And same with that's what this did so for the Black and people of color. That's what we did for the queer people. And so we built a camp that was mainly focused on creating workshops on safer spaces to address those issues and actually experiment practices as activists to have a more sustainable and more inclusive way to fight and to struggle together. And it's actually so the camp was in September, and it was in Hoek, which is in Vlaams-Brabant. And it was actually good to see that it's not that hard to actually converge, what people call convergence, because people know that their communities are impacted by climate crisis. Like you can see that queer people are more like vulnerable to homelessness during climate disasters. You can see that Black communities have been fighting for climate in the global south, for example, because they have like the lands that are actually helping us keep this planet safe. And so how we bringing these communities who have been for centuries in the front line back in the front line here in Europe as first impacted communities. So this is the basics ideas. And to actually see also, so when you're trying to create those connections, you can actually also see that there is an exclusion. There is something that we are missing in the way that we are trying to build something that's not even inclusive, but actually talking to everybody. Like when you say to people like, I'm gonna sacrifice myself for the climate issues, I don't have time for that. Like people just don't have time for that. People have actually like material needs that they need to get occupied with. But at the same time, they know that their communities are going to be impacted. So how do you deal with this binary of being oppressed communities, but actually, I would say, fighting for those issues? And so, yeah, that's what we've been building. And to make the connection for 2020, we want to continue to build those communities and to actually give people the space to create those communities who are active on climate, because they are queer for climate in the Netherlands, they are queer for climate in the UK, there are Black Lives Matter UK who've done like actions for climate. So you have many of those who actually already exist, and the idea is to maybe create or insert those narratives of first impacted communities in those white-centered European rise of the waters kind of narrative. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So a really interesting experience. How do we build much broader movements centering those communities most impacted, which takes us on nicely, in fact, to Juliette Rousseau, who's an author of a great book called Struggle Together. And I've got two questions. It'll be great just to hear, I think how do we bring struggles together is the topic of your book, so maybe it'd be great to hear from you how you think that's relevant to this 2020 debate. And then it would be great to get the context from France. So you're based in France, you're the coordinator of the Climate Coalition around the UN climate talks. And since then, that was you bringing together lots of different interests from trade unions and NGOs to leftists, etc. What's playing out today in France? What's different? What's the same? But let's first of all get a little insight from your book.
Yeah, I'm going to go very briefly on the book because I think who has just said a lot about what I wanted to work on, but basically as a former coordinator of that climate coalition and as somebody who has had a lot of power in militant spaces, I was willing to reflect on how to not repeat the mistakes and the wrong dynamics that I've participated to, which means basically criticizing the mere idea of convergence, the way it is put in France. Because until now, converging always meant that basically you had to converge and it would make some people disappear. It would be, converging meant you had to be somehow homogeneous, and this means that the more normative in the group, the more powerful will gain from the convergence, whilst the minorities, so-called minorities, will disappear, obviously. So the book was, the idea of the book was to go through different activist communities who are acting on the two levels, like the systemic struggle and acting on domination, on the domination, sorry, I'm really struggling with my English, on oppressions, the way they are active in their own communities. So it's not dividing the two, it's just, acting the fact that you need to work on those two levels. I think, and I'm going to talk from the French perspective, I don't know much about the Belgian one, but I think that in France, the climate movement is a pure example of how domination can play in militant spaces. When we were organizing around COP21, as you said, it was blatant that we were all white, middle, upper class, all living in cities, so not really feeling climate change in our daily lives. Like, we know of climate change, but it's a consciousness connection that we have to climate change. It's not something that we feel in our bodies. It's not something that threatens our daily lives. And I think this makes a really huge difference in the way you will enter in struggle, the way you will organize in your relationship to the state, in what you will demand. So back in 2015, it was not really great, and we were having troubles connecting the dots with other struggles. But I think it has changed in the last years. I think I see three elements, like in the social movement now, that really challenge the climate movement. I think the first one is all the groups that organize around France against police brutality. You might know of it, but the French police kills on average one or two persons per month. So there are groups organizing against that. It's almost all of the time these are non-white young men that are being killed, and the police is never being judged on this. They're never being punished. So it's an important part of the anti-racist struggle, and that is gaining more and more power and more visibility. Then the second movement is the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests, which really challenged, I think, the climate narrative, because basically at the beginning they were seen as anti-ecologists, like anti-climate activists, and nobody asked them what they thought about climate, because they were organizing against a law that was supposed to be a climate-friendly law. They were perceived like that. And actually, when you talk to people, there has been researches made, like sociological researches on this movement. You understand that environmental issues are really at core for them. It's just not what threatens the most their lives. So that's not the first reason they will go to the streets. And then I think the third movement happened this summer. It's called Black Vests, les Gilets Noirs. It's a self-organized refugee movement. They have organized massive actions, and they are now part of this big conversation. There are a few things I want to say, and I don't want to sound too negative, but in the meantime, I think there are some critiques that were raised already and that we need to discuss. I think there are parts of the movement, including the climate movement, that are now really, really willing to converge. The next big action that you talked about on the 5th of October in France is looking great. It's actually gathering yellow vests, black vests, and parts of the climate movement. I would not say the majority of the climate movement, but parts of it. So I think we're getting there, like parts of the movement are actually getting there. But in the meantime, we have, well, there are a few things, but there is a context that is not helping. We're in a very, we're living a really strong repression. I don't know if you've seen that, but it's become impossible to just demonstrate in France. If you go to the streets, people take off their yellow vests because if they know that if they wear them, they will just get arrested straight away. We have 2,000 yellow vests in jail right now, 2,000. So this is not political repression, I don't know what it is. And I think this is giving us This is a challenge for the climate movement as well, which is partly composed of NGOs, I think, which is also a movement that is really defined by this NGO component in the way that it is always claiming to be non-violent, to be non-confrontative to the state. That is, most of the demands that come out of the climate movement are really addressing state action, like asking for state action and not really looking at self-organization. And I think this is a really, it's making it difficult to converge with more grassroots movements and more confrontative ones. I think your relationship to the state as a movement clearly reflects your position in society. I think some parts of that society, and the Gilets jaunes are an example of it, the anti-racist movement is another. Some parts of our society don't trust anymore, don't trust the state anymore, don't expect the state to solve their lives. They don't think that the state is gonna one day come to conscience and say, hey, we listen to you, yeah, we agree, we're gonna help you. It's not gonna happen. It's all based on power relationships. And that's something that I think part of the climate movement still has a hard time dealing with. I think if we're saying that convergence needs to happen between those movements, it's not out of a moral necessity, it's really out of a strategic one. I think another part of the question is how environmental issues can easily be retaken, can you say that? Recuperated by the right wing and the extreme right wing, where we have that happening. If you don't connect the dots and if you don't look at how the system works, the hierarchies it creates and how you need to solve them, it's easy that the system will just recuperate itself on what you're defending, as a climate movement. So I think that's something that we need to be digging. And just to finish on that, and I know that this is a very French thing. Well, I don't know how it is in Belgium, but I see it as a really good news, the way that the French social movement is so alive, the way that what we call cortège de tête, the head of the demonstrations, is made of people so diverse, which is not something that the media is going to show you. But this is a really good news that we have so many people ready to really take the streets, even though the state and the police are doing everything they can to prevent them doing that. But I think I don't think that we're going to convince everybody. I think that's another illusion that some parts of them, and like some NGOs are creating, that we need to get everybody on our side. I don't think this is going to happen. And I think when we talk about system change, we got to recognize that not everybody has the same interest in system change. If you look at demonstrations that are vastly made of people who are privileged in this society, you need to truly ask them, what do you mean by system change? What are you ready to share? What are you ready to change in the way you live? So I think, for me, the priority nowadays is to look at where are the people really struggling, where are the social struggles happening in the social movements, and how can we converge? And I think the question of the emergency, the way it is framed in the climate movement,
has to be questioned as well, because of course the climate crisis is an emergency, but it's not the only one. It's really not the only one, and we need to take that in account in order to put different emergencies on the same level and try to see how we can work together.
Cool. Thank you very much. So I'm going to slightly abuse my position as a moderator and ask one more question. Ask questions. Water? Ça va? You're good? Because, I mean, we've heard here we want to get 10,000 people on the streets of Belgium involved in civil disobedience from Extinction Rebellion. We hear, I guess, different ways of looking at this crisis and at the struggles actually rooted in centuries of fights in the Global South. And it's a question of really whose voice are we listening to in this? And then in terms of how we organize and which communities and which struggles are we putting at front and center? Who are the most affected? Which is what the Climate Justice Camp has been trying to do. And how do we ensure they don't disappear? That when we do converge, they don't disappear. These are clearly things coming together that if we want to rise by 2020, these are taken into account. So my question to all of you, I mean, is it, given the conditions today, the domination, the oppressions, the balance of power, can we come together in 2020? And what's holding us back? What needs to change if we are to come together in 2020 to move beyond being a climate movement, to bring in the other struggles we've been hearing about? And what would it look like and who would be involved? So I don't know who would like to begin.
I've had the most time to reflect, so it seems fair I begin. Can we come together in 2020? Yes, but there are some bad habits that we'll have to break, and that comes to what is holding us back. And I think that in the climate movement we have, as you've noticed, been obsessed with the message of emergency, of avoiding disaster, And there are communities for whom disaster is already here. For whom collapse is already a reality, and it is already a matter of life or death, and they have all of the reason to have certain priorities in their struggles. And I think that in the climate movement, we need to rethink our message of collapse, and we need to begin to envision. We need to begin to think of, collapse could be an opportunity. We know that the climate crisis cannot be addressed with the economic system that we have now, because the economic system that we have depends on oil, and renewable energies will depend on renewables. So there's going to be massive limits, and there's going to need to be an incomplete overhaul of our economic system, and therefore our political system. And a lot of people know that our economic system and our political system are not working for everybody, and they're not happy, and they're looking for new leadership. And they're looking for it already in the radical left, and unfortunately, they're also looking for it in the extreme right. Again, as you noted, there's been co-optation of climate in a resurgence of eco-fascism that is very disturbing. And we need to show movements that are already facing their own social collapse because they've been targeted for violence because of who they love, because of who they are and how they want to express themselves. Those communities that have already been targeted and are already facing life or death, we need to show them that the climate transition is going to happen for them too. That it is that this is an opportunity to question our economic system and our political systems that have so clearly failed. Of course, when you have different relationships to power, it's very difficult to say, yes, we're going to have new systems of governance, we're going to have political parties or policies that are now for the first time, they're going to answer your concerns, and there's much reason to feel distrust and speculation, skepticism about the potential of that. But I personally feel that this is the only way, that a common envisioning of climate transition as an opportunity is the only way that we're going to be able to answer the concerns of other movements. And that's how we're going to come together in 2020. But apart from a better tomorrow, I think that we're also going to need to build a better today, which the climate camp in Belgium was very important for, that we're going to have to build community in the climate movement that is sensitive to everyone, that is built on trying to understand other movements and other priorities and what they need to feel included and to feel welcome when they can and they do decide to converge with the climate movement. And that is, yes, that is a better now, that is a better today, and I think that's something that we're going to have to continue to work on in 2020.
Okay, I'm going to be too long, so make me some signs. Okay, maybe in the audience I'm thinking people, okay, but we are speaking about convergence of struggle from the beginning and the title is Rebellion in 2020, and I hope that people are not lost and see the connection, because yes, if we want a rebellion, we need convergence, because for me rebellion also means there will be no rebellion without the lower class, if I can say. It has to be popular, and for the moment the climate movement is not really popular. So for me this is really the key. I will end with that, but I want to get back on, and maybe to get back on what we've been saying, but by the fact that we are not together in all the movements. And so for the climate movement there is always the same division. I'm going to tell what are those divisions. We have division because there is different identities in the groups. We have NGO who receive money. We have a certain culture. We have autonomous group like Yellow Vest, but other anarchists and so on. We have still the unions who are also an important stakeholder. So 3 different actors with different cultures. Another division is people who say that climate is the main issue and has to be on the top of the others, and other movement who says, like social movement, the social question is the most important. And we are all fighters who pretend. I've been struggling for food sovereignty for years, and I can say that food sovereignty is on the top of everything. And we are all struggling like that, saying that our struggle is the most important one. The third division that we have, it's the target. Some of our groups are targeting politicians because they think that politician has to change. And other groups are targeting companies because they think that companies has to change. And other groups are targeting themselves because they think that the change starts with yourself. And the fourth division that we have, it's about tactic. Some people think that we have to negotiate, to lobby, to discuss, and other people don't think it's possible even to negotiate, whatever is it with politicians, companies, and people think that we need to struggle. So all those divisions that we have now and that have always been existing, for me, to answer your question, in 2020, we will not be all together because those divisions will remain. But what can make that we are a little bit more together? I think the first answer is that we have to accept some diversity in the group, in the tactics, in the topics, and we have to pay attention to say, okay, we are really different. Our environmental NGO is really different from the Yellow Vest. But if you ask me, I will say you that we are allies and not opponents. We are part of we have divergence, but we are part of the same movement. We have more in common that oppose ourselves. I think it's the first step. Recognize ourselves as part of a movement against the 1%, against the Occident that is dominating the world for 5th centuries and so on. And I will end with this question. I think also that the other step that we can do to be together. So I will speak for myself. I'm really more into the social movement and the climate movement than feminist and anti-racist. And what I realized that in our narrative, for the moment, we are making an opposition between climate movement and social justice. And we start now, we succeed more or less to say, okay, we have to speak about the two. So we need to face climate change, but paying attention to social justice. I think we have to change our narrative. For me, there is no other way to tackle climate change without tackle social injustice, and even more, it's not a problem, it's not a constraint, it's an opportunity. I think there is no better way to tackle climate change than redistributing the wealth and struggle against inequalities. But for the moment, in the narrative, it's like, okay, there is a tension between those two. I will end with that. More and more, I'm not specialist, but people speak about the possibility that we will have a financial crisis really soon. We will be bigger than the one in 2008. So, or it's going to be a disaster, or it's the best opportunity that we have to connect the majority of the people, working class, middle class, and people fighting for the climate.
Ruth?
Oh my gosh, so I will not answer the question by a yes or no. I will just say, I'm gonna need to begin with no. So why? Maybe as Amaury said, just because actual connection creating between struggles takes time. It's just a fact. But what I think is really pushing us back, or like keeping us like for actually coming together, is the narrative, like understanding that climate justice is not something that you need to connect to other issues, but it's something that is inherently, historically, socially, how do you say, like a multiple issue struggle? Yeah. It's never like a single issue struggle. Like, check out this Audre Lorde quote, like, life is never like a single issue struggle. But it depends on who is talking and who has the power to set the agenda. So I would say, like, it's not a matter of habits. It's not a matter of how people feel or how they need to be included or how we need diversity and things like this. It's actually about the social system that we have. Like, we live like in a world that has systemic oppressions. And so the relationship that you're going to have to the states, the relationship that you are going to build, even in social movements, are going to be built on those systematic oppressions. So you need to ask yourself, as you are trying to come together, that who is setting the agenda? Are we setting an agenda together? Are we trying to come from the anti-racist views and trying to get like, I don't know, like maybe just even mediatic attention, like that would be like a first thought, like who is setting the agenda? Are we setting it together? Or are we just planning something for 2020 and just hoping that everyone is going to get the message and everyone is going to come out? Like, I don't think it works like that. I think you actually need to get yourself around the table and say, okay, I'm going to set myself an objective maybe for 2020 and what is achievable? What is achievable and who am I building it with? Where is the power in what am I building? Is it like just, is it still gonna be like 10,000 people of white people trying to get behind the red line when we know that the red line has already been crossed for so many communities? So I would say maybe that is what is bringing us, keeping us from actually coming together, that like we don't have, I don't think right now in the climate justice movement, like we have this place, time, I don't know, where we can actually get those agendas to work together and to actually build those connections where we can say like, we know those different struggles, we know we can work together because we know how to speak to each other, we know like the historic of the climate movement, we know the colonial past of the climate change, we know the career impact that it has. We know that we need to think about how we're going to rebuild, how we're going to write all those narratives that are are going to be more inclusive. And if we don't even have those spaces where we know we actually come together, how are we setting agendas? And also what I'm going to say, and I'm going to look at my notes. So, yeah, like the other thing that I learned, like maybe during the climate justice camp, is also that we have but it is like focused on the climate movement, I think, is also as activists to accept failures. So we are setting agendas to do this and this, and since we have like all these massive civil disobedience action, we think that maybe we didn't achieve this, but at least we get all these people on the street, or we did this, or this, or this. I'm comfortable accepting the fact that, for example, the climate justice camp, we didn't have like enough black communities, or we didn't have enough, I don't know, yellow vest movements or autonomous movements or things like this. I'm comfortable accepting failures, because in those communities, when you've been fighting like for hundreds of years, you know that somewhere you failed, somewhere you didn't change the system, because there is systematic oppression and other facts that you sometimes fail to organize yourself. And I'm comfortable with that. But I don't think that white, middle, upper class activists have that, I would say, humility to actually get to the point where you're going to say, okay, we failed, but we're going to do better. And I think we're going to do better. So I think, yeah, maybe by 2020, we're going to do a little bit better. Maybe we're going to get a little bit more communities. Maybe we're going to get these, maybe we're going to take the time to actually set those agendas together, and maybe even like put ourselves aside to let other communities decide like what is the agenda that we need to actually achieve, maybe. So that's why where I would say yes, like if we get that understanding of maybe we need to tackle the governments, but maybe we need to tackle somewhere else too. Work on those maybe binaries levels of actually building something within the climate and building something that can actually change the system. Yeah.
Cool, thank you. I'm not sure I have anything to add, actually. Yeah, I'm going to agree with you. I think the system has loads of cracks, and in those cracks, there are loads of possibilities for movements to emerge. So that's the good and bad news. And then I think when it comes to coming together, as for all the reasons that Ruth has just said, the conditions for that together to exist aren't reunited. So we need to question what that together means. We need to rebuild somehow that together. And I think this means having to lead with contradictions and differences in a way that we don't try and solve them necessarily. Maybe just start acknowledging them and start to maybe question, for instance, not presume that we have common interests, but try and discover them together, or maybe try and build some new common interests. I think that would be a good starter. And then I think we really need to think how we can empower each other as activist dynamics. And I think on this field, there are loads of things to be done, really, before coming together, thinking where I'm at with the power, the visibility, the abilities, the skills that we have, how can we help empowering other struggles that need more visibility, for instance? And I think this would be a really, really, really good thing to start and spread in the movements. And I think rather than thinking next year we're all going to be together, which we know is not possible, or I think we've stated that right now, thinking in 10 years, where do we want to be? And I think that's something that's really rare in our movements, is the ability to think, to be humble and think, we're not going to solve it in a year. So 10 years, 15 years from now, where do we want to be at? Who do we want to be struggling with what tools, what means? Building long term, I think is something that we really lack in our movements.
Cool. Thank you. 15 years from now, I dread to think what this place is going to be like, but hopefully we're all going to be on it together, fighting together. I'm going to open it up for questions. I'm going to try and take maybe 3 at a time. So raise your hand and we'll pass around a mic. Yeah, let's start with that. I had a few points I'll bring in at the end. Any questions? I mean, I've got loads of questions otherwise. I've got one here, one here, one here. Let's start that way. I'm going to ask you to keep it brief.
So I was thinking, so what you were saying, Amaury, that, you know, some people target companies, some the state, some the people. I think it's important to actually have diverse targets, because we can't think that the state alone will solve it, or the companies alone. So I think it's really important, actually, we have different people targeting different people, because it needs to come from every sides of the society. And I was wondering, do you see an homogeneous involvement of the society? You know, we talk a lot about the social, the lower class, social struggles, but what about the middle, the educated people? Do you see the same level of engagement? And how can you get those people that have maybe the more chance to influence, because they have the skills or the relationships, to make the bigger impact? So I was wondering, what's your thought on that?
Thank you. Over here, that person had too long a question. I have a feeling we may never get back to you if it's too long.
Yes, I just want to pick up on what Juliette was saying about this 10 or 15-year scenario. What would it take for you to actually consider that you've won? You know, what would it take to declare victory and say, okay, we can disarm, we can go back to our normal lives? Because I have the feeling that it would not just be limiting you know, global warming to 1.5 degrees. And second part of my question is, isn't there a risk of being too cynical, too distrustful of the system, where any concession that the system makes, any politician who makes some sort of a commitment, or some corporation that says we're going to stop using plastic or whatever, will simply be seen as greenwashing, as co-opting, and therefore you sort of interpret any kind of step forward as really a step backward.
Take those two. Is there a third short question? I'm going to bring in, as trying to keep some gender balance.
Just before this forum, we had the chance to listen to Bernard Stiegler. I don't know if you were there, if you had the opportunity to listen to him, but I think this man, but he's not alone. He's with a lot of intellectual artists, scientists, who are really thinking on a different way, a very original way. And they are thinking how to build concrete things, and they actually are really interested with the movement of the Youth for Climate. They are working with them. And I think this problem of working together, we are thinking about that since such a long time. Maybe we need some different views, and we are still very classical. I find the question very classical, and so I just invite you to look at the work they are doing, because it's a really high-level work with really very interesting methodologies, and so you can look to the Ars Universalis, and another one I noticed, another site. There was a meeting in London. I'll say it later. Yeah,
no worries, no worries. Thank you. So let's take these three here, and we'll have another round and come back to people. So we have diverse targets. Good thing. Is everyone homogenous in their involvement? What about the middle classes, basically, and the educated? We have, what does winning look like? Are we being too cynical? And are we being too classical in our thinking? Do we need to really think outside the box? And are we really limiting ourselves? So I don't know, who would like to start? Pick any of the questions, keep it brief.
About your remark. That's exactly why I say that we need to talk about system change. What does it really mean? Because if we talk about system change, I would think that a greener version of capitalism will still be a system that will exploit some parts of the world, that will not be here, but that will still be exploited. Even green energies need exploitation of resources and people in different parts of the world. So for me, the problem is capitalism. It's not making it greener, but I know that parts of the climate movement will disagree with me. I mean, there are even people who pretend that nuclear power is a green energy. So, you know, we have to talk about what it looked like. Now, about being too cynical, I don't think, I wouldn't fear a risk of being too cynical. I think I would fear a risk of being maybe too dogmatic, that there are some smaller wins or victories that are important to the movement. There are some smaller victories that will make some parts of the population live a little bit better, and this is not to be undermined. So this is something I would take into account. Now, greener companies is not something that I believe in, and when we talk about system change as something that the government can deal with, that's not something I trust.
I really love the question about when are we going to win, because what I was talking about just before is that when you actually set yourself to work together and that you set yourself maybe some achievable objective, you get those small wins, like you get those. Like for me, like the climate justice camp is a win. Like it didn't change the system. It maybe changed 400 people who came by and who like had time to actually think about things they didn't think before and stuff like this. But it is a win for me to see people connecting the dot between climate, racism, sexism, queerness, people being visible as they are, as complete identities, even if they are minorities or not, and that you can actually see people coming together in the same time, because like system change is not something that's going to happen. Like at least for me, I think that it's not something that can happen like in 10 years, in 20 years. It's something that takes and takes and takes years and maybe decades, centuries, I don't know. But for me, the small wins is that we want to achieve a goal that is maybe coming together and at the same time having the autonomy to also grow on our own as communities, but to set those little wins that we can see that maybe we didn't put like 10,000 people in the streets, but at least we didn't recreate a narrative that was sexist, that was racist, that was queerphobic or something like this. Like for me, these are goals that where I see maybe hundreds of people and I'm like, okay, we set this agenda, we get the media attention that we needed, we got maybe this little bit part of the cake, and this is a win. But it didn't change the system. It's going to change the system one day because we're going to build up. But at the same time, we created those moments where we set those objectives that are not, or at least are not trying to reproduce the oppression that we are trying to fight in a whole way. Don't just not taking like the climate as a single issue, as I said before. So yeah, I think there is win. But if there is win, there is also failures, and accepting them is just part of the activism.
Okay, I can try to answer, but about your question. So maybe I'm confused because I totally agree with what you were saying. This was my point, that it's good that people are targeting different audiences, because the problem is complex, and so the answer and the struggle will be complex. But one of our problems in the social movement is that we lose a lot of time to fight against each other because we don't have the same targets, the same means. This debate that we didn't open today about violence or non-violence and so on, it's really difficult for non-violent people to say, okay, I won't do that, I will not do that, but those guys are part of my movement, and the opposite also. Black bloc and so on, sometimes they have difficult to say those youth people making legal march are part of my movement. And so I think it's something that we have to do, definitely. And even when I'm saying this to myself, because I have my own opinion about what's the most important. And for the moment, my analysis is that I see so many people asking nicely things to politicians. And for me, we should reinvest this energy in constraining, how do you say? Constrain companies to stop polluting and destroying the planet's Earth and so on. So I have my own opinion, and I have to struggle with myself that, okay, to check we are part of one movement, and I have my own opinion about that. About the upper class and middle class, I'm also confused because my analysis is that for Belgium, in those marches, if we say that the most visible of the climate movement is the marches and so on, people in the marches and so on, if we say that there is something now, it's because it's upper class and middle class that are part of this movement. White people, upper class. So they are part of it. So for me, it's not how to engage them, but it's how to make them understand that for the moment, the story and the way that we are fighting is not the correct one. So it's once again this question of Juliette, is with whom do we want really to connect, and what for? For what? For me, they are in the streets, the upper class, and they speak about climate, but are they anti-capitalist? Are they really, do they think that part of the solution is that it's not possible to live on the planet Earth, and that it's not possible to win more than 2,000 euro and being ecological and so on? If they think that the solution is that the poor has to drop their cars and diesel and eat organic, so we have a problem. So it's not about connecting with upper class, but it's about what do we do with upper class.
Okay. So I'll start with the topic of artistic innovation and working together, because I think it goes back to what I was talking about of the importance of collective envisioning and the need to start envisioning. And you're right that there is some tradition to what we're talking about of the struggle, the focus on the struggle, the focus on the common enemy, the focus on the common sources of oppression. And it's always a resistance and a targeting of the enemy. And I think that when we begin to envision, we come into a different phase. We come into a very different phase, and there is a lot of potential in other methodologies. For that phase of envisioning together what would be a climate transition that would answer the needs of all. And there are methodologies like social presencing theater or dance, which are physical ways of finding out how to communicate with each other, and it really breaks some of the habits that we have in our relationships, and I think it can lead to a very a fruitful process of coming together and trying to do that envisioning. But there's also a burgeoning genre of climate fiction, which is really exciting because it's about, really letting your imagination run wild with what else could we do? If this doesn't work, if this system really doesn't work, what else could there be? So yes, there's a lot of exciting things that are happening in art for doing that common envisioning in innovative ways. Coming back to when will we know that we've won? I'm going to probably mess up this quote from Martin Luther King, which is that history is a long arch, but it bends toward justice. and come back to the fact that we probably won't win and that we should stop obsessing with winning and with achievement, because when we do that, you know, there's always another thing to win, and so we're never satisfied. And it's a recipe for burnout when you're focused on winning and when you're focused on the efficient achievement of the goal, and it's not regenerative. And that's why instead we should be focusing on how to carry on and how to support each other and how to build the community that we need in each other today, so that we can carry on, because we'll never win. Yeah. The risk of being too cynical or too distrustful of the system. My first thought when talking about this was that I know some green entrepreneurs, you know, and I know engineers that are working on small-scale renewable energy, and they are sincere in what they're doing, and they don't quite come to the political, but they really do believe in what they're doing, and what they're doing is an important part of the puzzle. And I think that we also need to recognize that it's consciousness of environmental and social issues is a process for everyone. It is a process of awakening and learning and reforming yourself and trying to be a part of the change, and that we need to celebrate the steps that people are making in being a part of that on that interpersonal level. But it's harder when I talk about the more critical thinking public level. It's harder to say, oh yeah, I'm really glad that that company, you know, stopped using plastic cups at their company cafeteria. But then it becomes a much more complicated discussion about what are the victories that we should celebrate. And we should celebrate, because if we don't, again, we burn out. What are the victories that we should celebrate, and what are the victories that we should say, no, this is not enough? Yeah.
Take a quick last round. Can we keep it short? Yeah? Okay. Otherwise I'll run away again.
Yeah, didn't want to monopolize the first questions with my sort of own agenda. I feel very emotional about the climate issues, and mostly because I feel I haven't done anything for my entire life, and I'm just finally waking up after seeing like Nicolas Hulot resigning, all the Extinction Rebellion and all the movements really empowering, and all the subjects you've discussed are really, really empowering, and it's sort of, I feel like I had this wake-up call 6 months ago, so I started being interested about this topic. And then I realized that the largest coal mine in Europe is just 2 hours from here. I've been following Ende Gelände. I was there on the 21st of June, trying to stop the mining machines to operate. So anyway, I have a very specific question. The building next door is actually BNP Paribas, and they are the main funding body of this largest coal mine in Europe. So I'm enraged when I discovered this, and I talked to friends of Earth and to different people, and there are probably 20 executives signing in every day just next door, and they're responsible of the largest source of CO2 emission. It's like 270,000 tons a day. So my question is, I've been struggling for 6 months, so what do we do about this? They're just there. So do we do anything? Do we wait for the banks to collapse? I'll be there on the 12th and on the 7th in London, but also I think the question goes for you, as you're involved in company lobbies and stuff.
Cool, and just to say, BNP Paribas is next door, but it's also here. It's one of the main sponsors of BOZAR. So just thought we'd be very explicit about this. Engie, one of the biggest European energy companies, one of the biggest gas companies, also sponsors BOZAR. So just FYI, I think we should make sure we're aware of where we are. I had a question over here. Monsieur?
Why are you so against recycling? Because if other groups or even capitalism is recycling the green message and then try to take over your points. that can't be wrong at all.
So multinationals doing a bit of change will be much bigger than us as individuals. Is this greenwashing? Is it not? I'm going to quickly, you can read it. I really struggle with French handwriting.
Okay. Sorry. I just recommend you to have a look to the website Bernard Stiegler was recommending. The first one is incarnation. .world, or maybe it's incarnation.org. I'm not sure, I didn't understand very well. There is a second one, ars industrialis, as a Latin expression, ars industrialis. And a third one is the experimentation he's doing actually in France, which is called Pleine Commune, P-L-A-I-N-E, commune.
Great. Do we have a third question? Perfect. Let's come over here. And I'm going to chuck a fourth one for myself and abuse my position again.
Thank you very much for the input. I wanted to ask you what would be your perspectives on life. In the sense that I feel that we are moving from the Anthropocene to the Biocene, if you will, if you think the kind of radical change that this will require. And when we think about climate collapse, because this is way more than a crisis, we're talking also in these movements about integrating all the struggles. We're talking about human life. But as we speak, life on Earth has been deteriorating and we have lost so much life. So what kind of life are we fighting for at this point? And how do we make that life, I mean, what is the conception that in the movements you are also dealing with when we're talking about life and value of life?
Thank you. It began very, very broad and existential and got back on. And I'm going to ask you a quick question. On the 20th of September, I was at the climate youth strikes in London. Were brought up by Bernard Stiegler as well. And I was amazed. I was actually stewarding. It's what old people do these days to young people's demos. And at the front of the demo was the decolonial group called Wretched of the Earth. And the youth seem to have got this, seem to have realized, I mean, I've never seen such a queer, feminist, like also working class movement that is getting it. And I was wondering, is this just London? Because London's a bit like this, or is this the youth all over? And what potential do you see in this new generation in terms of already understanding many of the debates that a lot of us have taken a long time and are still trying to get our heads around? So the questions are, youth, BNP Paribas, what do we do with it? Shut it down. Total saving plastic cups, does that make a difference? And what's your perspective on life? Are we too anthropocentric and do we need to be a bit further, look beyond human life? Does anyone like to start? I'm going to look this way this time. And you've got, so this is going to be, it's 24 past. So one question each, and maybe a nice little summary statement. Shall I start down this end?
So I don't know which one to pick. No, but okay, BNP. So there is BNP. We are really privileged. I don't know if you are from Brussels. It should, okay. But in Brussels, we have really thousands of bad guys here. So it's really a privilege that we have. Some people are living in the countryside, really far away. They want to fight for climate justice, and they don't have targets. That's a pity. We have thousands of them. There is just not just BNP. So ask Pasco. There is a guide, the lobby guide, in Brussels, and pick up like 8 or 10 friends. Organize yourself and go there, but don't invite people in a conference room because it takes too much time. But find friends, decide what you are ready to do. Are you ready to go to jail or not? Do you want to break some stuff or not? Organize yourself and go wherever you want. Yeah.
And come to us. I think either Act for Climate Justice or Extinction Rebellion Belgium would both be very happy to have you come and suggest targets and action plans, and bring your friends, the 10 friends. Multinationals changing will be bigger for everyone than small people change. In a statistical way, yes. In a conscientious way, not necessarily. I am a believer in, while small changes on a personal level are not statistically large, I think that they're culturally significant. And when we make that decision personally, and our friends know about it, and our family knows about it, it's a sign of our commitment to our values, and that sends a strong message to the people in the society around us. The potential of the new generation. No.
One question each. We haven't got time.
Oh.
Thank you for taking that one. Who would like to go next?
Okay, I want to answer your question, even though it's a very large question. I want to give just 2 elements of answer that will not be full answers, just elements. The first one is, as a feminist, I feel that my way of relating to life is in this world that is not about to collapse. It has collapsed a long time ago. Is seeking how to heal humans and alive things around me. How do my way of being in this world is a way of healing, is a way of building bridges, of strengthening my community and the communities that I'm part of. And I think that's why I'm trying to get to. But I think this is very difficult when you live capitalistic life in the city. I think you're disconnected by almost everything from life, and you don't have autonomy. Everything you get, you buy. You don't do anything by yourself, and you don't rely on other people. You actually have to build communities where you explicitly formalize a way of relying on each other, which you can do. I mean, getting out of the heterosexual model of living, communalizing things. You can actually rely more and more on each other, but I think it's still very limited. So the other element in my answer is an example of a place that I've lived in, and I'm not the only one in the room who's lived there, but I'm not gonna denounce anybody. But if that person wants to comment, they're welcome to. It's a place called the ZAD, which used to be an occupied land to struggle to fight against an airport project in the western part of France. There are loads of critiques to be made about that zone, but I think one of the things that are still very inspiring for me there is the capacity that people have had and still has to try and connect all the aspects of their lives by the way they live there. So everything you will do will be connected somehow with the living around you. Just one example is how you will develop skills to deal with the forest in a way that you can use the wood, and how you will develop skills. And it's not everybody that has to develop all the skills, but you will develop skills to then use the wood to build houses. And how is everything thought together in a way that will make the territory last, in a way that it's gonna be possible to deliver it in a better state than it was when we took it, to deliver it in a better state to the generations coming. And I think this is only something you can do at a small scale, and somehow you have to not escape the system, because it's not about escaping it and not being in touch with it. It's just finding cracks that you can be in and building those communities, building this collective intelligence in order to also be places of resistance, be places who can nurture and support other resistances. So, yeah.
Supposed to go to that. Okay, about the youth and the London March, I'm like extra following all these marches with Wretch of the Earth. Recommendation here, Wretch of the Earth in French, Les Damnés de la Terre, is actually the name of a book written by Franz Fanon, which is a black psychiatrist, and you should read it because you can actually understand the struggle of those decolonial climate activists and how it's related to all the colonialism, but just a fact. I think the youth is really inspiring in those marches to just be able to recognize things. Because I think the youth there, at least, because we didn't actually have this, I think, in Belgium, but to actually be in a place where people are claiming we are the ones in the front line in Europe, in the global south, and here we want to be recognized as the diaspora that is going to at least lead, but set the agenda or set the tone, set the narrative for the climate movement that we want to bring. And I think that's a very humble place to be in. And maybe the youth is more in a place there where they are not in an emergency, but in a way where they can say, okay, I heard you. I know that I haven't been here for that much of a time. I haven't been in that position of power where I had to actually set the agenda where those communities didn't exist, because we cannot say that we have like massive indigenous communities everywhere, or we have like massive black communities everywhere organizing around climate. That's not true. And but being in a place where you can say, okay, I heard you, I can see, I can recognize that we have like youth on strike, on indigenous communities, also organizing action against coal miners, against extraction, and how do you say it? Yeah, land grabbing, that's what I want to say. Stuff like this. This is where like just people maybe can be in a place where they can say, I don't have to let that power out, that as a youth, as a non-voter, for example, maybe, I don't have. And maybe I can be in that place where I can say that power doesn't belong to me right now, but I can just let it out. And maybe that's what people are struggling with in the climate movement, and maybe in other movements, to let go of that power that they have, to actually give it, empower other communities. And as we said before, and maybe to finish also like on a good note and have like a quote. It's a quote also for Martin Luther King. And I really love this one because it's really summarized, but it's really complex to understand. It says, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And to me, it's a good like resume of what I think when I'm active in whatever struggles I'm in, is to think that if the way that I am going to build a narrative is going to be unjust for someone else, I'm not bringing any justice anywhere. So yeah.
Pow, 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 pow. So massive thank you, first of all, to all our speakers. I think it's been a great debate. I think, thank you for the audience. Climate rebellion in 2020. Are we going to rise up by 2020, overthrow the system? I mean, it's been, will it be transformative? I think there will be people, from what I hear, rising up, for sure. We're going to have huge mobilizations. But who you rise up with will determine how transformative those mobilizations are. And making sure that those mobilizations can be transformative is not going to happen tomorrow. But it can be a step in that right direction towards system change in a post-capitalist system that goes beyond our very anthropocentric ways. And this is also determined by how close to power and the political class those rising up are. So I think that's what we've heard, is we need to move beyond a certain group and look beyond it. And I think the thing that came to me, I mean, we think we need to understand, if we're going to rebel, we're rebelling against extinction was really what this was about. But that's about defending a right to life. And it's people rising up to defend a right to life. In order to do that, you already have to have that right to life. That's a privilege to have that right to life. Many people do not, due to white supremacy and colonialism, due to patriarchy, due to heteronormative societies, due to racism, capitalism. I mean, so once we understand that people do not have the right to their own lives, to their own bodies, to therefore defend it for the climate, we have to bring this together or we're not going to get there. But I really hope that I'm hearing new energy in the room mixed with old hands, and hopefully next year can still be one that leads us towards a transformation that we were hoping to see. So a massive round of applause for all of our speakers, and tomorrow at 5 it continues. Et maintenant c'est la fête, en fait, c'est la fête ici.